kick off the conversation with the latest news flow that we're seeing around the energy transition and peak oil demand. The Saudi Aramco CEO saying the energy transition is failing and the world should abandon what he called the fantasy of phasing out oil. I'm just curious to get your reaction to those comments.
Good morning, Dan. I mean, in a sense, the CEO of Aramco has a point. Not just that the energy transition is failing or it's a fantasy. It is happening. We are transitioning away from fossil fuel because we have a noble cause to fight for, a just cause to fight for, that is climate change. But at what speed we are moving forward with this energy transition, moving away from fossil fuel towards green energy, this is where people get lost into translation, especially policymakers, because they are setting, you can see lots of targets are being set, detached from reality, and we are forgetting that fossil fuel, that is oil, coal, and natural gas, they still provide more than 80% of the world energy mix. And what we are trying to achieve today has not been done before, whether in terms of scale, in terms of speed, and in terms of drivers, where it's not driven by market forces or competition or huge technological developments. It's driven by changes in preferences. And in that respect, I find it very, very unrealistic to expect many of the targets set by governments around the world, particularly in the developed economies, regarding the energy transition achievable in the near future. It will take time, and we should think about the energy transition as complementarity between fuels, not as substitution, until the technology is more widely available to allow us to deploy renewable energy at scale.
And that's why OPEC is also up in arms at these latest IEA projections. The IEA saying last year that peak oil, gas and coal demand will come in 2030. Is that fantasy?
Look, nobody knows when peak oil demand will happen, or gas demand, or coal demand. These are based on different assumptions. So for me, I find it very difficult, first of all, to compare different outlooks, because these outlooks are based on assumptions. And a main element in these assumptions are government policies. And we all know that government policies are not cast in stone. But even if oil demand is going to peak by 2030, as the IEA predicts it, nobody knows how long will oil demand stay in that plateau, because a peak is not just a sharp point and then you start decline afterwards. You can stay in that peak for a very long time. And then how the decline will look like. Is it going to be steep? Is it going to be smooth? Really, nobody knows. So the discussion about peak oil demand should be much more developed than simply setting a date. And even if you achieve that peak by 2030, you still need oil to meet the continuous demand, taking into consideration the declining rate in existing fields. Otherwise, you're going to be faced with a tight market, and that would translate into higher prices. And as we saw from 2022, nobody likes high prices except producers. But governments in the rich countries, the main importing countries, they don't like high prices because their population doesn't like high prices. So it's just, I don't like the concept of peak oil demand, because it just simplifies a much more complex reality.
Indeed. Carole, just before I let you go, walk me through the latest pricing developments that we're seeing in crude oil right now. Prices tracking at a 4-month high following this OPEC decision to extend voluntary curbs. What is driving this most recent price gain in your view, and is it sustainable?
So we saw this kind of increase in prices, and we saw prices hitting 4 months high. And we understand why. You do have the geopolitical factors, not just the ongoing war in Gaza with no end in sight, but also the more recent attacks by Ukrainians on energy facilities in Russia. We had data on US inventories falling. We had positive data on industrial activities from China. All these on top of OPEC plus cut kind of created this kind of positive sentiment in terms of higher prices that we are seeing today. But the question, are they going to be lasting? There is a big question mark here, because data from China is unlikely to be sustained, because we saw this positive activity in China following the busy lunar year. We saw the inventories declining in the US, but we shouldn't forget there is lots of oil on water because of the ships or the tankers trying to find an alternative to the Red Sea. So that is adding a duration to the voyage, but it's a question of time before that oil arrives at the market. And geopolitical risk premium how much worse it's going to get in Ukraine, in Gaza. That remains a big uncertainty. But that aside, I don't see structural changes in the market to justify a lasting rally in prices. That's why we're seeing still prices varying in a limited corridor to date.